Good evening, everyone. My name is Saeed Malami, and I am the student director of the Mill Series here at Lafayette College. Sohrab Ahmari, who's with us tonight, is an Iranian-American columnist, editor, and author of non-fiction books. He is currently the op-ed editor of the New York Post and a contributing editor of the Catholic Herald. Previously, he served as a columnist and editor with the Wall Street Journal opinion pages in New York and London, and as a senior writer at Commentary magazine. Ahmari co-edited the 2012 book Arab Spring Dreams, an anthology of essays by young Middle Eastern dissidents. Ahmari's book, The New Philistines, a polemic on how identity politics are corrupting the arts, was released in October 2016 from Bite Back Publishing. In January 2019, Ignatius Press published his spiritual memoir, From Fire by Water, about his conversion to Roman Catholicism. The title of his talk tonight is Does God Need Politics? Please join me in welcoming Sohrab Ahmari to Lafayette.
Well, thank you to Professor Van Dyke for inviting me, and the Mill Series as well, and all of you for being here. I'm told that it's better to try to keep my talk as short as I can. Unfortunately, as you can see, I brought a quite thick pile of papers. I don't normally read. When I give talks, I just talk. But in this case, I wanted to give you a taste of a new book I'm working on, which poses 12 questions that I think our liberal modernity does not pose. And it's a personal book in the sense that I'm writing it for my son. I have a 2.5-year-old son. His name is Maximilian. And I'm worried about the creature that our civilization will chisel out of him. And so I want to transmit something to him. But the way I'm transmitting it is by posing difficult questions and then exploring each question through the life and thinking of one great thinker. I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a theologian, I'm a journalist and a popularizer. So that's the spirit of this book. I'm transmitting, I am not creating. I'm not coming up with new insights. But the process of transmitting itself has been quite exciting. Before I begin, just a couple of preliminary questions just so I can get a sense of the room. By raise of hand, how many of you had read the entirety of Augustine's Confessions? Okay. And how many have dipped into the City of God? Even not reading the whole thing, but dipped in. Okay, good. All right. That's good because, look, I mean, if I can give you a taste of Augustine, which is, I mean, his writing is just, and by the way, when I was received into the church, I took the name Augustine as my patron, so I feel a great devotion to him. So if I can give you a taste of his ideas, even if we disagree about other things, I think many of you may want to talk about contemporary politics, and I'm a journalist, and I have very sort of well-known views on things. I think we can get that in the Q&A. But maybe with the initial part, we can pull back a little bit and take a wider intellectual and philosophical horizon. So let me begin with a hard premise, which we can then explore in the question and answer session, namely that human dignity depends on some account of the divine origin and destiny of the human person. Put it another way, unless there's something special about human beings, then there's no reason to treat them as dignified and rights-bearing as our civilization tries to do. Again, we can explore that premise later, but if you accept it for now, for argument's sake, then it follows that a society that wants to fully honor human dignity must also honor the divine. Now, that is a crucial fork in the road that diverts liberal modernity from the great stream of traditional thought. The modern argument runs something like this. You may have encountered it either explicitly or not, certainly in a sort of osmosis, that since we can't agree on the highest end or the ultimate meaning of human existence, our political communities mustn't be devoted to matters of God or ultimate meaning. More crudely, religion and politics don't mix. Society as a whole can't honor the divine. Rather, the thinking goes, this is our society's premise, politics must be neutral ground on which citizens can vie over questions of secular public policy without God sticking his nose into how much taxes the wealthy pay, how we treat immigrants and refugees, how we organize healthcare, and so on. Spiritual concerns, thus, belong to a private sphere. Each citizen can hold fast to her own account of ultimate meaning, including, crucially, the belief that life has no meaning. Now, while overwhelmingly predominant today, this position would have been unintelligible to all the great traditions of the West. Neither the Jewish and Christian nor the Greco-Roman traditions made such a sharp distinction between religion on the one hand and politics on the other. But nowadays, even many Christians think that such a cleavage is not only possible, but even desirable. After all, didn't the poor Jew, Jesus of Nazareth, instruct his followers to render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God that are the things that are God's? As he was about to be executed, didn't he tell Pilate, "My kingship is not of this world"? Wouldn't the kingdom of heaven be tainted if it were to be commingled with earthly kingdoms? What need had God of Caesar's sword? In short, and this is our question for the evening, does God need politics? And to explore it, I propose we take a journey back to antiquity, and specifically to the late Roman Empire. The year is 410 AD, it's the autumn, and Africa's Mediterranean shore is witness to a sorry sight. Thousands of men and women of every social class, nobles and their servants, lawmakers, priests, artisans, others, disembarking vessels that had just carried them across the water from Italy. The young ones trembled about what the future might hold, while the elderly were just too dazed to worry, for their whole world had simply collapsed in a short span. The horrors that they had endured still seemed to flicker in the eyes of these new arrivals. They were escapees from the barbarian invasion of Rome. On August 24th, 410, Alaric, the Visigoth chieftain, broke through the last defensive barriers after a 2-year siege that had reduced Romans to cannibalism. The invasion was a catastrophe on a scale that we today can hardly fathom. Though the capital of the Western Roman Empire had by then been transferred to Ravenna, Rome was still the center of gravity of the whole Latin West, home to many senators and religious eminences and members of the nobility. Rome, as the eminent historian of late antiquity Peter Brown has written, quote, was the symbol of a whole civilization. It was as if an army had been allowed to sack Westminster Abbey or the Louvre, end quote. So the sense of psychological insecurity was somehow worse than the physical destruction. St. Jerome, the great biblical scholar and translator, spoke for the whole civilization when he wondered, if Rome can perish, what can be safe? Now, it could have been much worse. As it turned out, Alaric and his men for years had inhabited the peripheries of the Roman Empire. They weren't complete foreigners, nor they were utter heathens, but Christians of a sort, followers of a heretical sect that saw Jesus as a creation of God the Father. Pop quiz, professors accepted. What's the name of that heresy? Anyone? Yes, sir.
Arians?
Arian, that's right. Very good. For this reason, the barbarians spared at least some of the churches and those who took sanctuary inside them. Plus, as it would soon become clear, the barbarians were no more than ambitious blackmailers. They really just wanted a piece of the Roman power and wealth pie, and you can negotiate with people like that. Still, the sack of Rome was a sack, and the Visigoths inflicted on the Romans the full range of atrocities evoked by the words barbarian invasion, pillage, torture, rape, massacre. As if suffering these things weren't enough, the survivors who had escaped to Africa had to contend with a further indignity. They'd spent their whole lives in the Eternal City, amid the din of elevated Latin oratory wafting from the Forum, and then now found themselves in a relative backwater. Carthage, the capital of Roman Africa, was a lively, dynamic city, yet the area as a whole had lost much of its pagan splendor. The great amphitheaters had fallen into disrepair because of the recent turmoil. In other cases, remnants of the pagan past had been defaced, repurposed, or destroyed entirely because 3 generations had passed since the Constantinian conversion, and the religion of Jesus was now the official religion. The emperors regularly handed down diktats to suppress paganism and other rivals to the Christian faith. And the Africans The Roman Africans were men of a different sort than the refugees were accustomed to. They were beady-eyed, uncultured men, hardened farmers for the most part, even a few of them were fabulously wealthy. Many spoke a Punic dialect that must have grated the ears of men and women educated at Rome's great school of rhetoric. You couldn't even find a copy of Cicero's books in the Carthaginian bookshops, which I suppose the contemporary equivalent might be not being able to log on to Wi-Fi to check Instagram. And just beyond the olive groves that encircled the cities and towns lay a vast desert, its hot sands trodden by uncivilized nomads and their animals. What had happened? How had the Romans fallen so low? So for some conservative pagans among these refugees, the wellspring of their misery bore a Jewish name, Jesus. These men had never taken to the Christian religion. Now they gathered in salons to wax nostalgic about the polytheist past, with its dear old religion captured in Virgil's poetry, which taught them their glorious history and spelled out their true religious obligations. If only Rome had hewed to these older ways, things might have turned out differently. For clearly, this would-be Jewish king put to death by a Roman governor had failed to keep Rome safe. Therefore, a return to the gods of their ancestors was necessary. Who in Africa could answer these charges against the one God? As it happened, the region was home to one supremely influential Christian sage. He was a man deeply rooted in African soil, but who had earlier in life won entree to the most cultivated circles of Italian societies. He knew his way around the Bible, but also the works of Cicero, Varro, and other pagan sages. And he had climbed the summit of Latin oratory, the art the neo-pagans revered most highly. So this man, no surprise, was Augustine, the Catholic Bishop of Hippo. By the time the refugees arrived, Augustine was nearly 60 years old and of ailing health, and putting down this neosurgeon intellectual upsurge would form the magnum opus et arduum, the great and arduous work of his twilight years. So it's impossible to do justice to the life of the author of the Confessions. You must read it if you haven't. It is inarguably the greatest spiritual autobiography ever written, but I have to try to sketch an outline as briefly as I can. He was born in 354 in Thagist, a small town 175 miles from Carthage in present-day Algeria. His parents were poor. His father, Patrick if you want, was a hard man, a pagan given to strong drink who put all his hope in the education of his son, and that's because he knew that a classical education was the only passport to success for men of his class. His mother, Monica, was a fervent Christian, a woman of prayer and copious tears, who tirelessly beseeched the Almighty for the conversion of her abusive husband and that of her son, who would soon fall away from the faith. And Augustine would later address God in the Confessions about his mother, saying, "Within my mother's heart, you had already established your temple and laid the foundations of your dwelling place," end quote. His own heart and loins stirred with temptation. Few who read the Confessions will forget his account of joining a gang of kleptomaniac teens as they stole pears from some poor farmer. It wasn't the pears he wanted, he said. I had plenty of pears. No, I feasted only on the wickedness that was the fruit of my theft. Likewise, any former teen will recognize himself in the future saint who would take on a bad boy persona to impress his peers. When my actions were not enough to put me on a level with the hardened delinquents, I would pretend to have done things I have not. I've done that too. His father did little to restrain Augustine's wildness. So long as his son remained on the path to a remunerative career as an orator and lawyer, the old man was content. In this sense, the pagan patricius' indifference wouldn't be so out of place in our age. Only think of all the young meritocrats today whose parents don't bat an eyelid at any moral deformity, so long as Junior checks the right resume boxes and masters the patois of the professional managerial class. In the event, Augustine did excel at his studies after graduating from the University at Carthage. He spent a decade as a teacher of rhetoric, first in Africa and later in Italy. Along the way, he took a concubine, sired a son, then prepared for and abandoned a legitimate marriage. His departure for Italy occasioned another one of those immortal scenes in the Confessions, that of Monica following me to the edge of the sea, holding on to me violently, so as either to call me back or to set out with me. To rid himself of her, Augustine would tell her that she could accompany him on the boat the following day, but as the story is well known, he would in fact depart in the middle of the night, and she stayed behind praying and weeping. But in fact, Monica wasn't done. She wasn't prepared to give up on her son. A year later, she would sail to Italy to win him back for God. So to another mother's natural fears for her son's physical well-being, Augustine added anxiety over the state of his soul. While still in Carthage, he had joined a cult known as the Manichees, a conversion that deeply offended Monica's Orthodox Christian sensibilities. It all began in college when he read the Hortensius, a book by Cicero, now largely lost to us. But we know little bits from it. One of them is this, that if the souls we have are eternal and divine, then we must conclude that the more we let them have their head in their natural activity, that is, in reasoning and the quest for knowledge, the easier it will be for them to ascend and return to heaven. For Cicero, as for many pagan sages, philosophy's aim was ultimately spiritual. It was to free the soul to soar to its own home, the realm of eternal wisdom. Wisdom was the way, and it was the end. As a student, Augustine thought he'd found such liberating wisdom in the teachings of the 3rd century Persian guru Mani. Manichaeism had spread from Mani's native land, which happens to be my native land as well, all the way to the Latin West, and all the way to China in the opposite direction. And it described the world starkly divided between two kingdoms, light and darkness. The kingdom of light was the domain of soul and noble truth. The kingdom of darkness was the realm of the fleshly and impure. Human souls were bound, quite against their will, to bodies that throbbed with impure desires and did disgusting things like fart and bleed and defecate. Light was trapped in darkness, and the whole universe was a battleground in the interminable war between the two equally matched kingdoms. Right? It's not that one or the other is stronger, it's that they're ever equally matched. This was how the Manichees explained the problem of evil. They radically externalized spiritual conflict. And if you knew this, as a Manichee expert, if you knew this, if you had this knowledge, this gnosis, it was enough to heal your soul. Practicing the religion, of course, involved all sorts of austerities, what you eat, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, a central feature of the faith was this elaborate avoidance of any sense of guilt. The total break between the two kingdoms meant the soul remained untainted by evil. Never mind that blaming the body while exculpating the soul in this way vitiated personal responsibility. But for Augustine, for a time, it gave him comfort. But he was restless, and he longed for answers to his burning questions, and his Manichee handlers would keep saying, "Wait, Faustus will come, and he'll answer all your questions." He was a Manichee divine renowned for his debating skills. When he addressed the Carthaginian throngs, his apparent brilliance at first wowed Augustine, and I praised and extolled him like the others and perhaps more, he wrote in the Confessions. But when he got to press the guy up close, he found an ill-read man out of his depth. It was one thing to be a clever debater, able to win over crowds with laugh lines and pseudo-profundities. It was quite another to possess true wisdom. The bigger problem was that Manichee wisdom didn't console Augustine. How could he overcome his propensity for acts that, while pleasurable for a moment, left his soul soul-sore? Why couldn't he stay away from the gladiatorial fights, even as he sensed that watching this brutality degraded his character somehow? So these problems gnawed at him, but even so, he stayed a Manichee for quite a long time. Even after he arrived in Italy, he briefly stayed with a member of the cult. But as his Manichee fervor was on the wane, Augustine began to dabble in philosophy once he crossed the Mediterranean. In Milan, he was appointed a professor of rhetoric and entered a serious intellectual milieu. This milieu consisted of two often overlapping circles. One was Christian, dominated by Ambrose, the Milanese bishop. Ambrose was the churchman whom Monica, Augustine's mother, would implore to convert her son once she followed him to Italy. The other circle belonged to the Neoplatonists. These were gentlemen scholars who promoted a revival of Plato's thought. Now, at the risk of grossly overgeneralizing, and I apologize to the professors in the room, Greco-Roman philosophy as a whole, we can say, tried to get at the unchanging principle behind all change. Why was it, the Neoplatonists asked specifically, that the soul falls and loses touch with its deepest activity, that is, contemplation of wisdom? The answer was this, that a procession is the key word, of external appearances constantly distracted the soul. Each layer of illusion was further removed from the absolute immutable form of the world, from the capital O1, but remembering its former unfallen state, the soul constantly strove to return to the one. This Neoplatonic doctrine of procession, if you haven't heard of it, I gave you a relatively decent definition, though probably experts will watch it on YouTube and say, actually, but on the whole, I think it's right. This Neoplatonic doctrine of procession, as Brown notes, quote, brought pagan and Christian thinkers together within a single horizon of ideas. The end goal was the same, to return the soul to the unchangeable one. This was the highest good of human life. But a chasm, narrow but deep, divided the two sets of ideas. And that was the question of spiritual autonomy. The Neoplatonists thought that the individual could work out his own salvation by his own power alone. As he lay dying, for example, the key Neoplatonist philosopher Plotinus said, I am striving to give back the divine in myself to the divine in all. Salvation, then, was his effort, his striving. It involved his unaided rational assent, as Brown says, to wisdom. A Christian thinker like the Bishop Ambrose would have agreed that the soul was meant for reunion with the eternal and unchangeable. But he would put no stock by the saving power of one's own intellect or individual will. Self-salvation was impossible. Rather, salvation was to be found by God's grace and the grace-dispensing body that he had established on earth, namely the Catholic Church. Augustine tried the individualist route, but he finally couldn't will himself into purity and salvation. The force of habit was too strong. Even when he removed himself from the proximity of temptation, his memory still recalled the shape of a woman's curves, or the ecstasy of some long ago drunken revelry. Memory and habit tripped him up, so that he would cry out in agony in one of the most famous lines from the Confession, Lord, grant me chastity and continence, but please, not yet. That is, until his final conversion. In the year 386, Augustine, 31 years old, he has a nice job, he's financially secure, living in Milan with basically his buddies, living the philosophical life. I wish I could do that at 35. And late that summer, they received an African acquaintance, Ponticianus, who told them about the lives of the Egyptian monk Anthony of the Desert. Now, these desert monks were basically simple men. They were far less learned than someone like Augustine and his friends, but they had climbed stupendous mountains of chastity and self-denial. The more Augustine heard about their spiritual achievements, the more I loathed and execrated myself in comparison. He'd spent a whole decade since he had decided to seek wisdom, and what had he done with his soul? So agitated, Augustine retreated to the garden. He wept, he prayed, he cursed himself, and behold, suddenly I heard a voice from the house next door, the sound, as it might be, of a boy or a girl repeating in a sing-song voice a refrain unknown to me. Pick it up and read it. Pick it up and read it. He raced back to the sitting room, opened his copy of St. Paul's epistles at random, and read the first verse that caught his eye, quote, not in riotousness and drunkenness, not in lewdness and wantonness, not in strife and revelry, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh and its lusts. God had conquered the seeker. No sooner had I finished the sentence than it was as if the light of steadfast trust poured into my heart, and all the shadows of hesitation fled away. Augustine couldn't save himself. As a creature, he was a composite of flesh and soul. The higher, undying part of him sought communion with God, but the lower part, his corruptible flesh and his defective will, undermined the soul at every step. That much he knew before he flew to the garden. Then the Pauline words smacked him like a gush of hurricane wind. The only medium between God, the spiritual being, and a creature composed of spirit and flesh was faith, and faith specifically in the incarnate God, the God who became man. As he put it years later, this is from City of God, God's Son, assuming humanity without destroying his divinity, established and founded this faith that there might be a way for man to man's God through a God-man. For this is the mediator between God and men, the man Christ Jesus. Now the only way that is infallibly secured against all mistakes is when the very same person is at once God and man. God our end, man our way. So unlike what the Manichees thought, the point wasn't to go around flesh, but to go through flesh, to allow wisdom made flesh, to elevate corruptible flesh to the level of wisdom. Soon he would seek baptism in the church, he'd quit his job, he'd return to his African soil. And there he would enter the priesthood and would soon be appointed Bishop of Hippo. And he would dedicate the rest of his life until his death in 430 to thinking for and with the church he now helped lead. As a bishop in Roman Africa, people brought him problems, big and small. Both average, ordinary people, but also eminences would bring him problem. And he just had to answer these letters and epistles and sermons. And as he was doing this along the way, he laid the intellectual foundations for Christendom for a millennium to come. The overarching problem had to do with God and politics. Did government have a role in promoting faith? And did such faith work to the benefit or detriment of civil life? The immediate challenge arose, to bring us back to the beginning, from the neo-pagan conservatives. Before the rise of Christianity, kept saying, Rome had gathered great wealth and vast dominions, and their pagan forefathers were admirable men who had subdued their passions to their reason, and in the process built a magnificent commonwealth, a magnificent Republica. In mounting his defense against the neo-pagan onslaught, Augustine leveled a withering critique against the Roman past. By failing to honor the one God, he countered, Romans had failed to realize their own vision of the Republic. His arguments are as pertinent to our time as they were to the 5th century. That's a bold claim, but let me try. Neither Augustine nor his pagan interlocutors, as we've said, sharply divided faith from political life. Beginning with the Greek city-states, quote, the worship of the gods was deeply interwoven with social and political life. As the theologian Edmund Wildstein tells us, each city had its patron deities who bound citizens to each other and to the political order. Important rites were carried out by the ruler themselves to make sure that the city was safe and secure. And thus, quote, patriotism was piety and excommunication. And this didn't change when myth gave way to philosophy. To the classical philosophers, too, belief and worship were central to political community. To Plato, and especially his student Aristotle, it was clear that politics ordered all other human activities. Hence, the aim of all politics wasn't to protect maximal individual autonomy, but to discern and promote the common good of the whole community. Common goods, this is a useful definition, are those that only the community can secure, and they aren't diminished by being shared. Peace and justice, for example, only increase the more people partake of them. Now, what rulers believe about the final end or ultimate purpose of human life necessarily shapes their view of the common good. If they believe that the ultimate end of life is for everyone to hoard as much wealth as they can, not too unfamiliar, I think, to our age, then they will order politics in a certain way. But if they believe the point is to grow in virtue, oh, that's not Corona, not least charity, I am ready, they will order politics differently. Therefore, for Aristotle, as much for classical philosophy, the end of life was a public matter, and religion had to be fully integrated into politics. And Roman thought more or less adopted these ideas. As you probably know, the Latin word religio, the root of the English word religion, meant reverence not only towards the gods, but also toward human superiors. Therefore, religion was necessary for the maintenance and expansion of the Republic, which the Romans believed, or the Commonwealth, I should say, which the Romans believed they had been charged by destiny to bring to every rational being. Cicero, the same author who had set off the teenage Augustine on his quest for wisdom, had defined the Commonwealth as simply the property of a people. But a people is not any collection of human beings thrown together any sort of way. Rather, a true people is an assemblage of individuals associated with respect to two things, justice and a partnership for the common good. To repeat, a true people shared an account of justice, of what is right and what is due to each person, and pursued the common good of all. Were the pagan Romans a people by the crisp definition of their own master statesman and orator? Were Roman politics true politics? Were their civil life true civil life? Augustine didn't think so. And to rebuke his compatriots' pride, he would recast the entirety of human history as the tale of two cities, the earthly city and the city of God. This was his great and arduous work. This was the city of God. The glorious city of God is my theme in this work, he began. A city surpassingly glorious. The city of God is the community of believers living by faith in this fleeting course of time, traveling as a stranger in the midst of the ungodly. The earthly city, meanwhile, is home to those who prefer their own gods to the founder of the city of God, that is God. It is any earthly city whose foundation is the love of self, even to the point of contempt for God. Rome was the earthly city par excellence in his time, and part of Augustine's task was to prove that it had been just as violent, if not more so, before the legalization of Christianity and its eventual adoption as the official religion. This was easy work because Augustine knew Roman history like he did the wrinkles on his own face. The pre-Christian era, he showed, was no golden age of peace, the new pagans' sweet nostalgia notwithstanding. Rather, it was disfigured by horrendous violence, beginning with the very founding of the city, at which Romulus murdered his twin Remus. But Augustine's deeper project was to show that the Roman Commonwealth didn't add up to a true Commonwealth, because its inhabitants didn't, in fact, share a full and sound account of justice. Remember, that's one of the two requirements set out by Cicero, the excellent Roman, of what a true Commonwealth will possess. If justice meant giving each his due, as classical philosophy had always defined it, then pagan Rome fell short of it. Its laws, after all, failed to encourage and even impeded the fundamental human desire to know and love God. The impulse that the Neoplatonists had identified at the level of the individual soul, the longing to return to the one unchanging and unchangeable principle of the cosmos, the absolute behind all shifting ephemera, was blocked at the collective level. Simply put, Rome didn't give God his due, and therefore its justice wasn't true justice. As Augustine put it in a crucial passage in the City of God, I will take a deep breath, where there is not this righteousness whereby the one supreme God rules the obedient city according to his grace, so that it sacrifices to none but him, and whereby in all the citizens of this obedient city the soul consequently rules the body, and reason the vices in the rightful order, so that as the individual just man, so also the community and the people of the just live by faith, which works by love, that love whereby man loves God as he ought to be loved and his neighbor as himself. There, I say, there is not an assemblage associated by a common acknowledgement of right and a community of interest. Remember, that's the Ciceronian definition of a true commonwealth. But if there is not this, there is not a people, if our definition be true, and therefore there is no republic, no true commonwealth. For where there is no people, there can be no republic. Now, elsewhere in the book, caveat, elsewhere in the book, Augustine did seem to offer a more minimal definition of peoplehood as an assemblage of reasonable beings bound together by a common agreement as to the objects of their love. The higher the objects of love, he suggested, the more superior the people and therefore the more superior the commonwealth. Nevertheless, in the same passage, Augustine was quick to re-emphasize that a city that doesn't give God his due is, quote, void of true justice. It is notable, too, that Augustine devoted much of his book to showing that Rome wasn't a commonwealth under the first, more robust Ciceronian definition. At most, Augustine granted, the Romans had grasped the shadows of the real thing, much like the helpless Neoplatonic soul caught glimpses of the full truth in the procession of ephemera that passed before it. But still, a shadow is a shadow, no matter how clear or sharp its contours. Romans told themselves comforting stories about how they were spreading the rule of law to the ends of the earth, but Augustine exposed the amor laudis, the love of praise, and the libido dominandi, the lust for domination that lurked behind these lofty pretensions. And he laid the blame for this state of affairs at the feet of the gods who bestrode the pagan spiritual landscape. These gods were more akin to demons. They were lustful and capricious, irrational and chaotic. Anyone who's read any Homer will recognize what Augustine's talking about there. Hadn't the same revered Cicero, for example, condemned the Greco-Roman gods, quote, debased to the likeness of human weakness? Hadn't he poured scorn on, quote, on gods who are even introduced as having perturbed minds. They were crazy. Hadn't he denounced the shameful Homeric accounts of the lusts and cares and angers of the gods? What kind of deities fought wars between themselves or started wars between their human subjects? In Augustine's telling, the capriciousness and cruelty of these gods reflected not divinity, but the lusts and confusions of their adherents. The perversity was in turn mirrored in the various rites to these gods, who demanded propitiation, quote, with stupid and monstrous idol, with human victims, with putting a wreath on a male organ, with the wages of unchastity, with the cutting of limbs, with emasculation, with the consecration of effeminates, with impure and obscene plays. Given whom the Romans worshipped, it is no wonder that Roman politics exploded with periodic bouts of fratricide. Promise I'm almost done. Nor is it hard to see why the Romans lusted after domination of other nations, even if they draped this lust in rule of law rhetoric. At a more quotidian level, Augustine the African had seen the shortcomings of pagan peoplehood and later tried to correct them as a Christian bishop. Take almsgiving. Wealthy Romans liked to throw massive, decadent feasts at pagan holidays, their idea of redistributive justice. But to Augustine's mind, the feast-giving amounted to a pseudo-virtue rather than true charity, for the real purpose was to cement ties of mutual obligation among friends, clients, and allies, as Brown explains. You threw big parties to show off to other local bigs, not to help the poor as a moral obligation in itself. For Augustine, true almsgiving had to be anonymous and indiscriminate, quote, a judicious transfer of wealth from this unsafe world, says Brown, to the next. There were other evils, the rites offered by some farmers to pagan demons in the hope that food shortages might drive up prices, the miserable state of the serf-like tenant laborers, which only deteriorated once they achieved a measure of independence from their lords, and now the lords were freed from any obligation to actually care for the people who used to be in their charge, the overtaxation of crop yields by the administration in Rome for the consumption of imperial troops, and on and on. There was a kind of virtue at work in these cases, industriousness, martial hardness, and so on. But as Waldstein puts it, Rome's civic life was turned into a mockery by the fundamental injustice of not giving God his due at the level of the political community. By failing to order society to the true highest good of human life, well-being in the next world, communion with the source of all goodness, the Romans had deformed even their virtues into vices. High and important as they are, even virtues bloat with pride without reference to the highest thing, the highest being, God. As a Manichae and later a Platonist hesitating at the church's door, Augustine had struggled to rightly relate his body to his soul without God's help. Likewise, quote, Roman imperialists had claimed that Rome's rule of her subjects was just because it was advantageous to them, like the rule of soul over the body. But if the souls of Romans did not serve God, then there was no legitimacy to the rule of their souls over their bodies or of their city over other cities, end quote. But how, the neo-pagans shot back, how? Are we going to hand our government to you people who are obsessed with the world to come instead of this world? Against this charge, Augustine proposed the godly servant ruler. His or her outstanding feature, per Augustine, is, quote, true piety, the only source of true virtue. Quote, there could be nothing more fortunate for human affairs than that, by the mercy of God, they who are endowed with true piety of life, if they have the skill of ruling people, should also have the power, end quote. Such rulers necessarily take a religious view of governance. What does that mean? Well, they're slow to punish and ready to pardon, because they believe in penance and redemption. When they do punish, they do so in defense of the republic and not in order to gratify their own enmity. If circumstances do call for severity, servant rulers leaven it with mercy and the liberality of benevolence. Their luxury is restrained. Donald Trump, take note. Their actions motivated by love of eternal felicity rather than the ardent desire of empty glory. In short, servant rulers acknowledge the superiority or the primacy of the spiritual, and for this very reason they rule more humanely. Why? Because if you're afraid of something higher than you as a ruler, you might act differently toward weaker people. What might that look like in practice? Well, by the time Augustine wrote City of God, Roman history had already given the world an image of such a ruler. The Christian emperor Theodosius in 390 AD had had certain rioters summarily and brutally executed. In response, so outraged was the Bishop Ambrose at this massacre that he ordered him to perform penance on pain of excommunication from the Catholic Church. This is one of the famous episodes of late Roman history, and Theodosius complied. This was a political and religious earthquake whose magnitude is impossible to overstate. This man's pagan predecessors had wielded power quite literally as God emperors. If you were a good Roman citizen, you worshipped quite literally the God emperor. But now this emperor himself was acknowledging his sins and begging the forgiveness of a quite different God and his earthly apostle. The episode, Waldstein writes, remains centuries later, quote, an inspiring example of the primacy of the spiritual. By binding the political community to a higher power, the highest, in fact, Christian politics tamed power. The human dignity that men and women like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks had to strive for as a matter of rights under a liberal regime resided in this vision at the very root of power. This is the form of benevolent government, Augustine suggested, that would have existed even if sin hadn't corrupted flesh and rendered the will defective. It is natural earthly government ordered to the city of God, where, Augustine wrote, even those who give commands are at the service of those whom they appear to command. For they do not give their commands out of a desire for domination, but rather out of dutiful concern for others, not out of any pride in ruling, but rather out of compassion for others. This is what the order of nature prescribes. This is the way God created man. Now, we began by asking, does God need politics? God doesn't need anything. He is God. But the God of the Bible seeks to transfigure everything about us, including our cities. He wants to help our political nature find healing, in Waldstein's apt phrase. That might sound like a big, scary claim to ears marinated in liberal assumptions about the purpose of politics. Then again, liberalism itself, and I don't mean by liberalism the left here, then again, liberalism itself came as a shock when it claimed to totally sever politics from the shared quest for the highest goods of human life. It's liberalism that's new. It's liberalism that's only about 300 years old and has to prove itself. Today, the very words highest good evoke the specter of bloody religious wars and persecutions. In the liberal frame, any attempt to politically discern, much less achieve the highest good of human life, is bound to yield intolerable coercion. For right-wing or classical liberals, even the common good, let alone the highest good, is a synonym for status oppression. The most we can hope for in our common life in this view is to just protect our basic shared interests such as security and contract enforcement while allowing each individual citizen to pursue those goods she deems highest. For most of us, that means wealth, career success, tech superiority, and the like. But these are private and competitive goods. Remember the difference between a private good and a common good. As such, they give rise to plenty of coercion. Only much of the coercion we suffer is meted out by private actors. Is the employer who digitally monitors every second of his workers' time in a punitive way, not coercing them? Doesn't a large, sophisticated corporation act coercively when it enforces, a 50% interest rate against a high school educated single mother? What about the 11-year-old who encounters hardcore pornography online and develops a lifelong addiction to ever more extreme and exploitative imagery? Isn't he coerced by his own defective will and the ready availability of prurient content? Liberal societies do coerce then. More than that, they enshrine a vision of the highest good. All their secular pretensions notwithstanding. After all, the very notion that we can't know, much less legislate, humanity's highest end is itself a metaphysical, even a spiritual claim. And it stands at the heart of the modern project. Its God is the unbound self, and the worship of such a God will inevitably have political consequences. Vast accumulations of capital, much of it concentrated in a very few hands. A ceaselessly disruptive culture colored by kaleidoscopic lifestyles. A heavily armed commercial empire. But is all that enough for a truly just political community, a true commonwealth? That's the problem fueling popular discontent across much of the developed world in our century. And accounting for the accidental changes, it would have been squarely familiar to Augustine. What would the Bishop of Hippo make of our situation? He would certainly find in the modern West an assemblage of reasonable beings bound together by a common agreement as to the objects of their love. namely the love of unbound personal liberty and of wealth. Perhaps such loves can sustain the empire yet, for a while yet, in God's good providence. But so long as our hearts stir restless for something higher, the city of God will beckon them to find rest in its geography of love. Sancta Augustina, ora pro nobis. Thank you very much.
I mean, it's always interesting to pinpoint areas of actual debate in the world, like things that morally decent, very well-informed, intelligent people actually profoundly disagree on. And one such debate is whether it's a good thing that Christianity seems to be dying in the West. Because first of all, I assume you kind of agree that it is. Please tell me if I'm wrong.
I think I'm called to be hopeful but not optimistic. Those two are different things, right? Optimism is your sense that, well, things are going to turn out okay, but you can be hopeful because you have the kind of theological virtue of hope. You try to have you perfect the theological virtue of hope, knowing that in your lifetime things might not turn out as you would hope that they would, as you expect that they would. So, is it dying? Look, I see the numbers of the rates of mass attendance among people in Western Europe and in the U.S. You read the polls. You pick your horrific poll from the point of view of a religious person, where only about a third of U.S. Catholics believe that the real presence of Jesus is in the Eucharist and so forth. I mean, there's mountains of evidence, but I think, look, did people expect under communism that you would have in Poland this flowering in the form of John Paul II, that then suddenly this growth of a religious movement where people came out under totalitarian conditions saying we want God when John Paul visited? So God works in these mysterious providential ways. And I would say that I do see among a cohort of young, serious Christians this revival. People have written about it to some degree, but trying various things, various models, and I find hope in those. And then look, if the center of gravity of Christianity shifts to Augustine's home continent, as it is, where the church right now, the Catholic Church, has its greatest demographic hope is in Africa and South Asia. Why not? There's and maybe people in African Christians will re-evangelize the West in a kind of reverse movement of what happened in the past. Why not?
Well, and Christianity is also growing in China, although it's more evangelical Christianity.
It's more evangelical.
Is that something that you're happy about, though, because it's a Christianity growing?
Yeah, I mean, look, whenever people turn from a kind of soulless, I wouldn't even say it's communism, because it's not communism, it's this weird totalitarian state capitalism, whatever it is, turn from that to praying and thinking about the highest ends of human life and what life is really about is a thing to cheer. Yeah.
Oh, did you want to continue?
That's it. No.
So.
And the question is it a good thing?
Oh yeah. Well, let me ask one more thing that's kind of related to this. What is your view of someone like Jordan Peterson, who, to some extent, in a sense, is re-evangelizing? Screw all.
No. I'll tell you something very. I mean, I mentioned earlier there are pockets of young people. I was invited to come out with. I live in New York City, and I was invited to come out to a brunch. And brunch is very typical. It is our Sunday liturgy for a lot of people.
Hipsters in
Brooklyn. But I was invited to brunch, and they were all kind of curious young New Yorkers. And they said, we came back from, they had gone to an Episcopalian service. We just came back from an Episcopalian service. I was like, okay. Like, they weren't the type. and because the day before they had gone to a talk by Jordan Peterson, and going to that talk had somehow inspired them to go to, I don't know, an Anglican service the following day. So, and that's what I'm talking about, because look, the longing to know what the meaning of life is, and to first of all know what it means to act morally in the world, and what your purpose in life, and so on and so forth. These questions aren't going away, and so if Jordan Peterson is a channel of evangelization, all power to him. I began reading Nietzsche when I was 13, and it, in a very circuitous way, led me to Catholicism.
Well, Peterson thinks that Nietzsche is much less anti-Christianity than he's often.
I would disagree with him.
You would disagree on that?
Yeah.
Okay, so, right, but anyway, the debate I was going to mention, and again, I started by saying it's always interesting to identify true areas of debate. You know, because a lot of debate is just fake and it doesn't really stand up. But independently of whether one thinks Christianity is dying in the West or not, there's a lot of debate about whether that's a good thing.
Yeah.
And I mean, obviously, you're going to line up on one side of that, but just to throw out some names, like people like Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, the late Christopher Hitchens, you know, the four horsemen of the New Atheism, they would argue that it can't happen soon enough. You know?
Yeah.
And then there are others, obviously Jordan Peterson, also other members of the intellectual dark web, like the Weinstein brothers. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they're actually pretty anti-New Atheism as well. And then other more storied thinkers like Dostoevsky, Solzhenitsyn, would argue that it's probably a bad thing if Christianity is eroding in the West. So I guess, I mean, it's clear, right, that you would line up with the latter group, but I was curious, like, what's your basic response to people like Dawkins, Harris, Hitchens? Like, what would you say to them if you were actually in a room with them? Because, you know, if you just cite like your religious beliefs, they're going to be like, oh, well, those are irrational and that's a non-starter for us. Like, what would you say to them if they were in the room making all their arguments?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I wouldn't begin with revelation. I mean, as men who call themselves men of reason, I would try to, I suppose, begin on the ground of natural theology, right? In other words, what we can know about God without revelation, right? And so here, the scholastic tradition, and especially St. Thomas Aquinas, Dawkins especially, has a very shallow critique of St. Thomas. And a lot of people think, for example, that many of the five proofs for God are in a way a theologized version of the Big Bang. So if you talk about the argument from the first mover, they think what you mean is, first there was a little atom, and then it grew up, and then blah, 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 and then the planets came, and then the dinosaurs. And that's what you mean, which is not kind of the metaphysical argument from... So anyway, I mean, that's where I would engage them if they were deigned to argue with someone like me. But, you know, at the end of the day, is it good that that Christianity is dying? If it is dying, I would say that all of their ideas, and this was a premise that I began with and then I didn't really explore, all of their ideas about human rights, or, you know, Hitch believed that Saddam's regime was terrible and so forth, all of them rest on the idea that the human being is special. All of them rest on the idea that you're there's something inviolable about you. You bear a dignity. How do you explain that if we are nothing more than just a bunch of synapses firing and flesh and bone, and there's nothing really special about our origins? Why shouldn't we treat people in completely beastly fashion if there isn't something special about them?
Do you attribute the mass atrocities of the 20th century in Western Europe in part to Western and Eastern Europe in part to...
Absolutely. I mean, these were all, in the case of Stalinism and so forth, it was militantly atheist. And then in the case of Nazism, it's this kind of, it is a kind of neo-pagan upsurge, right? It's a return to the god of the idolatry of nation and of race and so forth. So absolutely, and I don't know how the absolute secular liberal who believes in human rights and human dignity, where is the basis for that dignity?
Yeah, because one thing you said is right. Well, because one thing you said is if you completely sever liberalism from, completely sever politics from religion or a vision of man's ultimate good, as liberalism does. And I stopped there because, of course, small L liberalism does mean inalienable rights of the individual to life, and that's actually a substantive argument that if the Nazis and the communists had believed in, would have spared us a lot of bloodshed. So that's not a trivial thing for everyone to agree on, that every individual has inalienable rights.
Yeah.
Now, I'm guessing you might argue that that notion itself is predicated on Judeo-Christian ideas, and if those ideas die, then liberalism is going to die.
Yeah, the procedural structures will lose all the kind of metaphysical foundations upon which they rest. Again, I don't see how you account for a human being as special, rights-bearing, dignified, if he's just a collection of atoms and synapses and cells.
Do you have a kind of elevator pitch view of just like capitalism, neoliberalism?
Like where I stand on economics?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. I would... First of all, I mean, I get into arguments with libertarians a lot, as you may know. But on discrete issues, I'm perfectly open-minded about the fact that, for example, a lot of the problems having to do with homelessness and skyrocketing housing prices in typically blue cities, New York and San Francisco, are just a supply problem. You've set up so many sort of NIMBY laws where you can't develop housing, and so then the existing housing stock becomes obscenely expensive. And that's a perfectly fine argument that I buy into and would promote myself. My problem with a certain kind of doctrinaire economic liberalism, and I don't mean the left, I mean the kind of classically liberal kind of capitalist tradition, is that it takes that insight and makes it the kind of unum necessarium, the one thing necessary. Whatever problem in the world appears, markets and let people choose. That's the kind of thing I oppose. It's a kind of dogmatism where in some other areas, markets don't have the solution. And we on the right, I'm a man of the right, should be willing to say, there are, that ultimately we have an economy in order to serve the common good of actually existing people. The economy is not this thing with its own immutable laws which we can't at all touch lest they go wrong somehow. It's also a human institution. It should be ordered to the good of people and families. Now, I have to believe that in some areas free markets do serve them, but in other areas they don't. And you begin to see a kind of flexibility, at least on the right, which I find most welcome, where for years there was this dogma that just to integrate China fully into the world economy. It was, and having been part of that part of the right, it was just a kind of dogma. China, and any problems that arise, there are WTO mechanisms. We'll just resolve it with them. Blah blah blah. And now you have people being like, wait. They put 1 million people in concentration camps. It's a regime that, for all sorts of reasons, you won't want building your 5G infrastructure because they'll spy on you. And this awakening has happened, at least on the right, which is very welcome. So, first of all, the fact that the economy is ultimately a moral institution and should serve those ends, and in some cases that means government intervention to promote the good of families, the good of communities, and second of all, to lose the obsessive dogmatism of free markets everywhere, open borders everywhere, absolute free choice everywhere. But that's it costs us, and we're living through all sorts of consequences of that.
So one concrete policy view you might have, tell me, it would be like we should have maybe maternity and perhaps
Sure.
paternity leave policies more akin to what you see in Northern Europe?
Absolutely. So before I launched my famous debate with David French, which I hear we'll get into, a couple of folks around the magazine First Things and others, we put together a little manifesto called Against the Dead Consensus. Oh, yeah. And we do mention that the political community, because its most essential unit is the family, must be geared or ordered towards serving the needs of families. So that might mean, absolutely better maternity leave, so that, or even doing things that could get people out of the two-income trap altogether, right? When people, where both parents have to work, and either it brings pressure on them when they want to have children, it discourages them, and when they do have children, it makes it so that they immediately have to put children in daycare when they should be home and so forth. So that's the kind of pro-family policy we see. In Hungary, in Poland, elsewhere, they're experimenting with it more aggressively. By the way, in some areas they're liberalizing, right? Like taxes were too high in Hungary, now they have very low taxes. Labor laws to the point where they become so protective where you can't ever fire anyone. Of course, it actually just keeps young people out of the labor market, fine. But in other areas, you have a robust welfare state that serves the good of families.
Okay, last question, and this is going back to China a little bit. So I have a student who's doing an independent study this semester on AI, and he's talking a lot about China. And I think everyone knows this, and I don't know too much about it, but basically China is instituting the system where the citizenry is monitored.
The
and
social capital system, or
right,
the social
credit system.
Right,
and it's not that you're arrested and sent to jail for any kind of perceived moral or civic infraction, but it may be harder to get a loan. You may be less likely to get into a good college. There are these ways that the Chinese state is like raising the cost of antisocial behavior. And the thought I had as I was reading about this is that this is one of the pragmatic arguments people make for religion, that it basically gives people a reason not to behave antisocially and therefore makes polities function better. And it's actually a much lower cost, scalable way of getting the population to behave in a virtuous moral manner than just repressing them. AI, this system that is kind of running on its own without too much government, it struck me almost as like serving the same function in China that, for example, Christianity to some extent has played in the West. Now, obviously, it could be abused. But I did have that thought. My thought was like, well, if it's used well, it could just get people to be less likely to push someone out of a line. Maybe I shouldn't admit to having that thought, but I did. I honestly had that thought.
Well, let me. First of all, one tragedy that brings to mind is the fact that the Chinese have a very intricate, ethical, well-developed ethical system. In Confucianism, that has a tremendous number of I would say natural virtues that classical and Judeo-Christian traditions also promote. You will find in Confucianism, not least filiality. Right? Your parents aren't just a random fact about you. That there's something special about them, and therefore you're obligated to serve them. And in all sorts of ways, it ripples out to a complete vision of life. And it's sort of tragic that after 1949 and the Mao's takeover, the communist regime really waged war against the Confucian tradition. Even during the Cultural Revolution, they even went and exhumed or whatever, his burial site to prove that Confucius was dead. And now, symbolically, culturally, now they're having to do a neo-Confucian kind of revival. It's a kind of what part of the PRC's vision of, okay, how do we order this massive society is, well, let's go back to Confucian, which the same regime pulled the roots out of the society. So that's one thought that I had. But no, absolutely. I mean, look, if you have at the level of the individual, you have a worldview that says you should subsume or subordinate your baser self to the higher part that's in you, that the conscience that already speaks to you and tells you in some ways, it points you towards right and wrong, and you have a worldview that at the individual level and at the collective level are part of the society, then you don't need minute regulations, right?
Right.
You only need this kind of minute regulation. Or think about, I mean, I dare say I go into a campus thing here, but when you had an ethos of let's say a kind of paternalistic Christian ethos about campus life, you didn't have this amazing bloat of administrators telling you at every step, be as risky as you want sexually, but we're going to regulate it at every step, and God forbid you do something wrong, and then you get interrogated, and then there's no mercy, right? If you've been accused of wrongdoing. Whereas in the more older model, there was just separation, and guys couldn't get into girls' dorms, vice versa, and it needn't have this minute regulatory. So if you have a kind of robust vision of a moral order that people both at the level of individual and collectively buy, you don't need minute regulation. Well, I had one other thought about this. Oh, and that's the cultivation of the conscience, right? I have a 2.5-year-old son, and I notice he gets into fights over toys at play dates, and he will. What's funny about it is when he grabs a toy out of a fellow kid's hand, he could just be a brute about it and just do it. But kids don't. They always say, like, it's mine. And for someone like John Henry Newman in the 19th century or C.S. Lewis in the 20th century, that was a really odd thing, and it said something about human beings, right? That you always try to, with whatever argument you get into, you try to provide a reason and appeal to a law. There's a sort of unwritten law of toddler land, right? And the other kid will say, you violated it, and Max will say, no, you violated it. But both of them, they don't have a doubt that there is a law of toddler land, and that's it's the law embedded in us, in both the divine law and the natural law, and they reinforce each other. And they tell you have this voice inside you that says, do good and avoid evil. And you really want to do away with the worldview that says that voice matters, right? That voice is a divine voice inside you, and say, no, that's fine. We'll implant a chip in you that'll zap you when you're wrong. And by the way, there's no redemption in the Chinese model. If you're antisocial, you just there's no. Right. You just spiral downward. Yeah. They even have a ladder of rewards and punishments, and there isn't that Christian idea of maybe you could really turn things around. Anyway.
The hammer.
Terrible nickname.
The hammer of Ahmariism.
It's good to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Thanks for coming. So after that profound religious discourse, I'm sorry to take things back to more profane manners, but first I want to start on something maybe less contentious, which is you're sort of known as a partisan pugilist, but when Professor Van Dyke asked you about neoliberalism, you talked about high interest rates, damage to the family. You sounded quite a lot like a Marxist. You talked about the two-income trap. I assume that that phrase originates from a book written by Senator Elizabeth Warren, recently late of the presidential race. So I just want to ask, you talk a lot about this, and you talk a lot about war with the left, but when I think of the policy proposals that solve what you talk about, I think of the wealth tax, I think of Cory Booker's baby bonds, I think of mandatory paid family leave. So do you see areas of cooperation with the left, despite your reputation to the contrary?
Oh my goodness, of course. Okay. Of course. No, look, I mean, what the dead consensus folks, what we're promoting is a truly a kind of hybrid where we do find common cause with the left on precisely the things that you mentioned. On the other hand, I think one concern I have about the kind of full-on social democratic shift on the left is it geared towards the idea that the economy should serve people and that there is an end to human life that is its proper end, both natural human life and then a spiritual end, forget about the spiritual end, but at least a natural end where you should have families and so forth? Is that what they're pursuing, or just a more bloated welfare state to allow ever more people to just sort of maximize their autonomy, and just be able to, do whatever you want without a kind of vision of what is the end of a human life, what should you achieve in a human life? And I think that's where you would find disagreement, because we concede to them XYZ economic points because we have a moral vision. And I just wonder to what extent they would come along with us on that moral stuff.
Okay, yeah, no, I think that's fair. I mean, certainly I can't speak for everyone on the left, but there's been a recent deluge of articles in places like The Atlantic, The New York Times, talking about what are essentially, in part, social conservative complaints, the decline of the family,
sure,
collapse of the nuclear family, declining number of children, more loneliness, more depression,
sure,
thousand social ills. And one of the key observations of people on the left who are having all these drastic new ideas in the economy is that these problems essentially don't exist among the rich, right? Among people who go to colleges, among people who are well off, they get married, they have kids, they have stable families, they participate in community organizations, perhaps not in the church, but perhaps in other civic groups and political activities. So to the extent that this problem is purely economic, it seems like you do have some agreement with the left.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, that's a good, happy thing to start with. So then I want to move on to your famous David Frank's argument, and
yeah.
I watched some of the YouTube videos. They were very compelling. I tended to think you did have some good points, which is your side essentially has lost every social battle of the last 50 years, right? Things that were once unthinkable are now commonplace. And I think you do have a point, which is to say you can appoint however many judges you want. You can win however many elections you want. But as Professor Van Dyke said, religion in this country is unlikely to return to its previous place, right? Things that we have agreed on to accept as society are probably unlikely to become anathema again. So I guess the key question I want to ask is...
Unless we win.
Well, okay, but so what is winning?
Look, I would say that the problems you listed are problems not just for Catholic conservatives like me, but for all of us, right? I mean, yes, to some extent, we've gotten to the point where our elite can just live in its own enclaves and completely be impervious to what's happening with marriage rates, with divorce rates, with fatherlessness rates, among people on the lower echelons. But ultimately, it touches them. You can't. At the end of the day, you can't separate a society to that degree, and we're bound up to the extent that we are a commonwealth, at least according to the minimal Augustinian definition. We're in this together in some ways, and you have to address the problem. And when I say winning, I mean that we shift to a totally different kind of, at least conservatism, the side of the debate that I have some say in, of which the current administration is only a kind of chaotic foretaste.
Okay.
And you can, but that you solidify the vision, you have a more thoughtful, non-erratic spokesman or woman for it.
Is Hungary the model for that?
Well, I mean, it depends on the, Orban would not make the mistakes that Trump makes every day.
It's true he doesn't allow his opponents to run in fair elections.
I think that's not quite right, because, look, if you win, if you're winning super majorities year after year.
Like Hugo Chavez?
Well, yeah, but there's no one in jails.
No,
like that
but
in
there
Hungary.
are subtler ways of accomplishing the same task.
No, but look, there's the idea of Hungary as this crazy repressive state is a fiction. Do I approve of every single step that the Orban government takes? No. But the idea that you have a dictatorship when it's a more popular government than many of the governments that accuse it of being a dictatorship is astonishing, and it's false, right? If you go to Hungary, you can surf any website you want, you can say whatever you want about the prime minister, and the comparison between Orban and Chavez is factitious. It's ridiculous.
I mean, I agree with you. He is not shooting people in the street. But one of the interesting things is there's a parallel here. Last week we had a left-wing YouTuber, and he talked about his love of Chavez, and I think Maduro, though he was subtler about that.
Yeah.
And I think there is some parallel here, because I agree with you. It's not as bad. I would rather live in Hungary, certainly, than in Venezuela under Maduro. But in Hungary, if you operate a media organization that is critical of the regime, you will find your taxes audited. You will find inspectors finding rats in your premises. You will find these are classic tactics in political science. They happen all over the world.
Sounds like what the IRS did to Tea Party groups in 2010-11, huh?
I think that is a highly contentious statement. But in any case, conservative media organizations, Fox News, right,
Yeah.
operates openly as a conservative outlet and did so under Obama, and maybe he criticized it once or twice. In Hungary, all major media conglomerates are owned by friends of the regime, by allies of Orban. There is no large-scale independent media. Sure, there's bloggers, there's social media. You can go to a cafe and denounce Orban all you want. But you cannot operate the same kind of organized, large-scale political organization in media, in civil society that is needed to wage an effective opposition. And so I agree with you. He has a high approval rating. So does Vladimir Putin. So did any number of leaders, and I agree, dictator might be a strong term, but who tilt the playing field. And, I agree.
Yeah, he tilts the playing field, yeah.
But Hungary is over there. But why it matters to this is when you had your debate with David French, one of the things he said to you that I thought was a really interesting point is he said, if you change this sort of viewpoint neutrality in the public square, you open yourself up essentially to reprisals. And I agree, there have been some cases where Democrats have adopted some of the illiberal or whatever norm-damaging rhetoric of Trump. I don't think it's that frequent, but I think it's a trend that might be growing. You saw Chuck Schumer's comments the other day. But the solution to that, and you didn't give this answer, but I don't think you answered it, at least in my view, in a different way either, is to say, well, if the other side doesn't get back in power, we don't have to worry about that. So Viktor Orban has violated any number of norms. But you can't really tell a Hungarian conservative, oh, what happens when the opposition returns to power, because it's just not going to happen in the current political order. So is on some level a premise of your argument against this viewpoint neutral liberal order that you're just going to keep the other side out of power?
It's more that it's a tiresome thing to fight these procedural battles which we often lose.
Okay.
Right? So I'm saying, look, let's play big.
Yeah.
Right? Like, let's play big and say, we have a vision for social order. And let's dispense with the fiction that culture is only downstream from politics. Everything we know about ancient history tells us that that's, and recent history, that that's not true. Yeah. In other words, one way you shape culture is by changing law.
Fair enough.
Right?
So what's a law you'd like to change that affects culture downstream?
Oh, any number of things. I mean, I don't want to, but the point, because I want to answer your first, I will give you examples, but I want to answer your first question fully, that the conservative movement for a long time has said, you know, the best we can do is just fight little procedural battles, see what we can win, and to every complaint about how maybe we should do things differently, they've responded by saying, well, you know, what if they get into power and do things to us?
Yeah.
And they are doing those things to us, right? I mean, speakers shut out of campuses and so on and so forth. I can give you the litany. So they are doing that to us. So what is this argument? Is saying if we propose our vision and attempt to legislate it or attempt to kind of wage political combat, they'll do things to us. That's a stupid argument. They are doing things to us. So might as well fight on the battlefield that we have. They give you an example. I mean, things I would change. I mean, by the way, a lot of them would be ones where you and I would maybe find common ground. You know, maternity leave and so on and so forth, for sure. But I would certainly bring back. By the way, it's not a radical change. Bring back the obscenity laws. None of them are. Ever since this nation's founding, we've had robust obscenity laws.
Yeah.
Right. These are common law obscenity laws. They've always been there. There's no reason why we shouldn't be enforcing it on the internet. There's no reason my son is at. Statistics say he's. I mean, I'll do my damnedest to prevent it, but he is likely to encounter hardcore porn before he hits puberty. That's a really unhealthy civilization. There's something really wrong there. And it's only a kind of recent legal change, right, where the government decided that it's not going to enforce the same common law obscenity laws that have been on the books since colonial times. It's not going to enforce them. We're going to enforce them again.
Okay, but so do you think the fight for obscenity laws, and I will be clear here, I have
It's not for them because they're there.
Okay, yes, for their enforcement.
Yeah.
I have absolutely no knowledge of the constitutional principles here, but it seems to me that if you seek to enforce obscenity laws, you can advance this as a public political movement, you could seek to put judges on courts that will enforce them. That does not seem to me...
you would do it via the Department of Justice.
Okay.
Right.
That does not seem to me something that requires a departure from the political order, like
No,
obscenity laws.
but David French said he wouldn't do it.
Okay, well, fair enough.
Right.
I cannot speak for him. But you can pursue obscenity laws without damaging democracy. I think that's a quite clear thing. But you cannot do what Viktor Orban has done without damaging democracy. And so,
when did I say we want to do what Viktor Orban
you
done?
seem rather fond of him. But so the question is, the conservative movement and Trumpism and Ahmarism, is this what we call it, seems a lot less scared to me if it cares about obscenity laws, right, than if it cares about what it currently seems to care about, which is keeping the other side out of power by potentially any means necessary.
Wait, what has the Trump administration done in that regard?
I mean, any number of measures that are, again, sort of nascent visions
Give me an
of what
example.
Orban has done. Well, for example, the Voter Fraud Commission attempts to provide pretexts to suppress votes, which certainly is being done all over the country in any number of states. Attempts to use the recent impeachment
Do you have to show ID to buy alcohol? Are you of age?
I am.
What's a more significant thing?
Certainly
voting or...
But there is no
Why is it-
evidence of voter fraud in any scale. There is, in fact, massive evidence of people
But if
denying
there's
the
some
rights
of it,
to vote.
is it a crazy thing if there's some of it to try to
No,
redirect?
I think there is a reasonable balance.
That is not a tilting
Hang on.
of the field. That's just,
There is a reasonable balance between those two visions.
is Canada a horrible authoritarian regime?
No, but Canada has countervailing measures that, for example, make it easier to get ID, right? But, for example, closing polling places in minority communities, that is not something that can be
I would
justified.
oppose that.
Okay, well, that's good. Well, I welcome your encouragement of some
that the
liberal
Trump
judicial
administration doing
policies.
that?
No, I believe the Bush administration did it too. Certainly it's something that is allowed by the overturning of the Voting Rights Act. But in any case, we've gotten off topic a bit. But what I want to ask you basically is, I don't find obscenity law scary. I don't find much of your political agenda scary, even as I find Trump terrifying, because I see his type of politics as the same type of politics practiced by Orban and Erdogan and Maduro and Putin. And so what I want to ask really is, what do you... Your faction of the Republican Party supports Trump right now. And in many ways, it could end him. Religious support for Trump is a core base of his support. It won in the 2016 election. If he wins re-election, it will win him the 2020 election. And let's say, hypothetically, I am the Democratic Party, and I'm coming to you and I'm saying Donald Trump is unacceptable to this political order. But I think there are areas for common ground. We have family leave policies, say baby bonds, whatever. What do you want to abandon Trumpism? What is it that would make you abandon this sort of procedural assault on parts of our political system?
I mean, I don't accept the premise that what I do see is an administration that was elected fair and square, and a bureaucracy, a permanent bureaucracy, and an opposition that has tried every procedural trick to subvert the duly sort of expressed will of the people at the ballot box. So I don't share the premise that we've gone through a period in which there's been this kind of tilting that you talk about. If anything, we've had an administration that has been far, contrary to my own fears in circa 2015-16, has been hemmed in. It's been hemmed in by the permanent bureaucracy. It's been hemmed in by some of the president's own idiotic moves. It's been hemmed in by all sorts of things. Yeah. And would you say the media hasn't been aggressive the past 3 years? Has it been muzzled?
The media has certainly been very aggressive.
I mean, certain things. So we don't have a kind. We're I think on the whole we're playing fair and square. So the only thing is, what do we do with this power? I think Trump's going to get reelected. So what are you going to do with that, right?
And what you want to do is obscenity laws?
Well, that's a huge thing.
Okay.
That touches a lot of people. It's just one example, but I think it's a very pertinent one, because the only reason is the Supreme Court handed down a decision. Actually, it was, by the way, it was pornographers versus, actually I think it was the ACLU versus the Clinton administration. And the Supreme Court in the 90s said the reason that you can't press various kinds of obscenity charges against pornographers on the internet is that whatever Communications Decency Act or whatever it is a law that was meant for widely sort of available broadcast media. And the internet is not something that's going to be like that. It was seen as a niche medium. It's been 20 years later, who watches TV anymore? Everyone's on their phone on the internet. So the one plank of sort of anti-obscenity was dropped for this foolish reason. And yet even, the Trump administration hasn't quite responded to calls yet. So we'll see what the next sort of 5 years will bring.
Okay. All right, I'll ask one or two more and then we'll open to the audience. So I guess just a follow-up there is, and again, I've said this, I find what you say not particularly threatening to American democracy. But when you see Donald Trump, you find him talking, and you mentioned the bureaucratic assault against him, whatever, and this is also rhetoric that is shockingly common to Erdogan, to Putin, to Chavez, right? The same patterns. Maybe there are some bureaucrats opposed to the incumbent. The incumbent is...
Yeah, there are FBI agents texting each other, saying, we got to take him down, and the other one saying, we will.
And there are FBI agents leaking information hostile to his political opponents. It's a complicated world. But when I see him talk like that, right, and I agree there are all kinds of arguments you can make there, but quite aside from that, right, I find is usually best when assessing these things to err on the side of questioning a potential authoritarian, because it is very clear that he talks like all these populist leaders we've talked to. And so I just wonder, what is it, you talk about Orban as the better version of Trump. And I think in one part of that because he tweets less and is less incoherent. And certainly, certainly I appreciate that. And we've talked about the coronavirus outbreak. I would like someone competent running my country at this point too. But I just wonder, when you look at Orban, or you look at Kaczynski in Poland, what is it about them that you think is better? Do you think they're more religious? Certainly the religiosity in these countries is shockingly low. There's really no evidence it's increased. They've marginally increased the birth rate. What is it that you find appealing about them?
I mean, certainly the religiosity, of course. And by the way, turning around fertility rates and birth rates is not something you can do that easily.
I agree.
I mean, the best you can do is marginal. We have to get into it because these countries are complicated, and we're talking about them in this sort of sweeping generalizations. But Having gone through a century of catastrophes in both their cases, religiosity might take a while to recover and for their identities to come back. But look, I think the idea that political community as such exists to serve the good of a family and then of a people, right, is not a crazy thing. In so many ways, these governments that you're so worried about, a lot of their policies would have been normal Christian democracy in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, before Christian democracy, more or less.
Yeah, their social policies, their economic policies.
Yeah, there's just Christian Democrats in some
problem
ways.
is how they got there.
They won overwhelmingly, dude.
Yes.
Overwhelmingly, over and over again. I mean, and the more the liberals sort of attempt to use underhanded procedures to undo these governments, the more popular they get.
Do you think it's an underhanded procedure to operate
I'll give you an
critical of the regime?
I'll give you an underhanded example. It's that literally I was in a meeting with in a room in London with essentially Polish liberals and liberal friends of Poland, a month after the Law and Justice Party had won the election. They went around the room and people are saying, "Well, we've got to ask the EU to impose sanctions for what? Because people voted the wrong way."
I believe for purging judges from the judiciary.
Which were holdovers that were the previous government had rejiggered the laws, right? It had stuffed the courts and Law and Justice undid it, right? So, but the whole idea of as soon as there is an election, we will not work within the sort of frame of democracy. We will immediately seek to sanction you at Brussels. We will immediately seek to, essentially wield bureaucratic power against you. That's bad for liberals. It says you can't win, right? You say you don't have confidence that your message will win with people, and that's not a. If I were a liberal, I wouldn't want that. I would try to say I have a vision. For wherever polity you're thinking about, you say, I have vision and I'm going to win with that. What arguments have the other side on all these debates have put forward as a sort of vision of what society should be? Increasingly, you can't find one, right? Other than sort of these sort of cultural, ever more niche, 57 different genders, blah, 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 which doesn't answer people's needs. It doesn't answer bread and butter issues with people, jobs and labor rights and so on and so forth. It doesn't answer. So it's become an ever more niche ideology of the elite, which seeks to win even when it fails at the ballot box. Well, I'm saying as a man of the right, I'm asking the left to say, go win at the ballot box. In this sense, Bernie is very admirable. Bernie is not, again, he's not my man, believe me, he's not my guy, but he's just like, I have a vision for this country.
Yeah.
I have an idea of where this country should go, and I'll solve your problems. That would be more dangerous, I think, to Trump than the erosion of norms.
Okay, but hang on. Saying the erosion of norms is politically ineffective is a perfectly fine argument. Bernie Sanders makes it all the time, right, as do his supporters. Yeah. But for example, the opposition in Hungary and Poland, which does talk a lot about norms, also talks about raiding the public treasury and massive corruption, incompetence, etc. But quite aside of that for a second, I think, and this will be my final question, I want to leave it open to everyone in the audience, but is one of the things that you talk about with David Franklin, where I think you sort of have a point, is that conservatives, social conservatives, especially in the pre-Trump era, the pre-populist era, really weren't winning very much at anything, right? You've talked about all these things that were once considered outside the mainstream that are now normalized. I know you're fond of talking about what happens at libraries. So my question is this: I don't think you can win in our current political orders. Not just demographics, the poll numbers are stacked so massively against you. The decline of Christianity is so massive, and this is due to macroeconomic forces. The country is richer, the country is more individualistic. Maybe Marx was right, maybe the sacred has been destroyed by capitalism. So my question, and I think a lot of why I find you and others find your vision a little concerning, is if you want to bring back these old moral orders or obscenity laws or whatever you want to call them, I don't find those things intrinsically dangerous, because certainly America 50 years ago had all kinds of things that are now no longer acceptable, and America, at least after civil rights, was a democracy.
Yeah.
The question is just, if the vast majority of Americans disagree with you on many of these issues, and they do, A, how can you win, and B, are you willing to accept the loss? Because that is the most fundamental principle of democracy.
Of course you will accept the loss if it comes, but at least you should, first of all, try. And second of all, I would say, again, the idea that we wouldn't win on these issues is premised on the idea that culture is one thing and it's going in one direction and politics is another. Now, politics, the law, deeply shapes culture. You would be surprised if a political order changes, how quickly people will also change their minds. And they will forget that they held the contrary position 2 days ago.
What's an example of this?
What's that?
What's an example of that?
Well, I mean, and it's a very good example, but it's actually the victory of the civil rights movement. The legal and political victory of the civil rights movement has, in many ways, and thank God for this, has made racism culturally utterly unacceptable. But we didn't say, well, let's change all the Southerners' minds one by one. We might change. We just said this time has come. It's 100 years too late after the Emancipation Proclamation, and the legal change led to a cultural change. Or think about it. Actually, gay rights.
Yeah, no, it's true.
It went from
the public opinion has been shocking in this direction.
But it changed in response to political change, in response to judicial fiat, really. But whatever. Political change.
Okay.
Right?
Well, I appreciate
It
your
was judicial
endorsement of this progress.
Well, no, that's what I'm saying. And so and I don't endorse the outcome.
Okay, yeah,
but
the process,
I don't
yes.
endorse the outcome. That's a very
Yeah.
what was that? I don't understand what you're trying to get at.
No. Well, so what I'm saying is all these changes.
No, but
yeah.
the point was that the legal change changed people's minds.
But all these changes, civil rights, gay marriage, first of all, they've tended towards more liberalism, towards the expansion of individual rights. And second of all, they've tended sort of, I don't know what the opposite of against the grain is, but towards the flow of public opinion, right? You saw civil rights becoming more popular over time. Before the civil rights movement, you see gay marriage, which had been a political weight on the Democratic Party for quite some time. You see the Defense of Marriage Law, et cetera, already shifting. So you see essentially, and the argument of gay marriage opponents was, let us lose at the ballot box and not at the courts, because they saw where the wind was blowing. These were all changes that essentially ratified shifts in public opinion. If you seek, for example, to reimpose or reintroduce, I should say.
I get your point. All I'm saying is it is imaginable to also imagine the reverse.
Okay, but it seems like they're all happening sort of with the grain of public opinion.
Yeah, well, we'll see. And people can be fickle.
Okay,
Let me just tell
we'll
you
see. All right, well, I appreciate that. Thank you for talking to me.
Yeah, see you there.
And we'll open it up for questions.
Just based on some points on the conversation you just had with Dan, I do think it's important to note that I think it's wrong to pretend that Donald Trump did win at the ballot box when he actually lost by 3 million votes.
No, he won at the ballot box according to the rules we have in place.
Sure, but the rules we have in place, like when you say he won by the ballot box, it implies that he actually had the will of the people, when if you actually look at the will of the people, he lost by 3 million votes.
At some point, this becomes a sort of semantic debate, or at least a kind of.
It depends on what you mean.
It's a kind of.
I don't want to have
fictional in a fictional country he lost, but in this country he won. Right? In some other dimension he may have lost.
Right. In the dimension of the actual votes cast.
They didn't have an electoral college, but. Hillary could have campaigned in Wisconsin. She didn't.
No, but that's not
No, that's what I'm saying.
Sure.
According to the rules of how we win presidential elections in this country, he won fair and square.
I'm not contesting the fact that he won the Electoral College. I'm just saying I don't think it's fair to say that he won the will of the people when the will of the people and this is not
the
where
will of the people as
Okay.
our system constitutionally expresses it.
Sure, but again, this is just a semantic
becomes
argument at this
semantic,
point.
yes. But thank you. Okay.
Your basic premise that human beings have no dignity, and please tell me if I'm misrepresenting what you said, but it's impossible, like human beings cannot have dignity. You cannot believe that human beings are dignified compared to other species unless you believe in a higher being.
Yeah.
And you said, oh, let's just accept this for the sake of argument and then
Yeah.
move on. But I just don't really buy that premise, and a number like Aristotle, for example, used the claim that human beings have dignity simply because of their rationality, and it had nothing to do with their belief in a higher being. Why do you believe that your viewpoint is correct compared to a number of other philosophers who vehemently disagree, or who would vehemently disagree?
I guess I would say because the rational soul is the imprint of God. I mean, at some point you have to ask, how did you come to have a rational soul? So in other words, I would extend, because Aristotle didn't have the benefit of revelation, but now that we do, I would extend the idea of his idea and ask, what is the source of our rationality? Now you might say various evolutionary processes, blah, 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 some cells, da, 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 blah, blah, okay? Or you might say, it's purely synapses firing in our brains, right? Okay, I accept all that. That only answers, for me, it only answers how questions. It doesn't answer why questions, right? In other words, you might say you can pinpoint the source of rationality to some cell, some thing, some synapse, some whatever. That's not the same as being able to answer why did that emerge. That's still a sort of a scientific, to be fair, it's a scientific answer. Although we don't have a scientific, precise scientific answer, but it's something like it. But it still doesn't answer the why question. So insofar as we have a rational soul, its value is not legible unless that rationality has some origin that matters. Otherwise, it's still just, at the end of the day, at the root of it is synapses and cells and blah, 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 blah.
And the other question I have that's more policy-oriented is, I'm always fascinated by Christian perspectives on the state of Israel. Would you consider yourself a Zionist?
Yeah, I would.
Okay. How much of that belief would you say is predicated upon
On Christianity?
The Christianity and the idea?
None of it.
None of it.
None of it. It's only because it's a matter of fairness that, first of all, a nation state that has recognized itself as a nation for a very long time has a right to its own national homeland. And so insofar as I wouldn't challenge, I don't ask why the Italian has Italy. I also think it's fair for the Jewish people to have their own national home. And it's not about the, obviously I'm not an evangelical. I'm not a dispensationalist. I'm not hoping for the ingathering of Jews so that the end of days may come. It's a purely secular matter.
Well, it's important to note that people laughing about that's actually what a number of people believe.
Yeah, sure. I mean, and if they come to the right conclusion by wrong means, I'm willing to get that. I'm willing to take that as someone who's a friend of the Jewish state. So no, it's a purely secular matter. Just that of all people who deserve a nation state of their own, the Jewish people certainly do. And look, the other models were tried, right? In the 19th century, Herzl, before he formulated political Zionism, Herzl in college was a member of a German nationalist club, right? And what did he find? German nationalism then took on a kind of biological component, so that even if he was enthusiastic about it, he couldn't fit in. although all the sort of Jews who converted, it didn't do them any good when the nation state became a racial project. So everything else was tried before the Holocaust, by the way. This is all we're talking in the 19th century. Everything else was tried until finally he came up with Zionism. And then the Holocaust gives it this added impetus, but that's not even the basis for why there's a Jewish state. So, yeah.
Why is the main part of your argument based on the fact that Catholicism or like Christianity has to be like the religion that government has to abide to, instead of any other religion that also holds these like very important values? And let me say that Buddhism is not the reason why Vietnam or any other country in the Southeast Asia or like South Asia resolves to communism or socialism. It has nothing to do with it. And so like, having established that, having established that, like, what do you think Christianity or Catholicism is the only way for this to be the implementation?
Well, first of all, it's at a base level of me encountering you in a political public square, it's not the only. In other words, I would, insofar as the God of the Bible is reason itself, right? In the opening of John, in the beginning was the Word, but the Word is really, in Greek, it's logos, right? And logos also means reason. So the God of the Bible is the Word, but he is with the Logos, and he is the Logos. So insofar as I meet you on a public square, I would want, in my desire to know my God better, I would first want to know what values you bring. And so I don't know much about Buddhism, I'll be honest, but I do. For example, my wife's Chinese. I have a great interest in Confucian philosophy, which is why I mentioned Confucius. And so I've really gotten into the Analects and the commentary, the Han Dynasty commentaries and so forth around it. And you're right, there are truths that are natural truths that are very worthwhile in the Eastern traditions. And so as a political dialogue, with someone like you, I wouldn't necessarily begin with Christianity, but I would wonder if, insofar as these religions point to a moral way and point us to try to be moral in the world, I would then press to say, what is, again, to go back to the question of conscience, where is the source of this voice inside, which clearly Confucius, for example, tapped into because he was clearly aware of the conscience. He would say, his students said of Confucius in the Analects, "From whom does Confucius not learn? For humaneness resides in everyone." That's as Christian a statement about the conscience as you can get. That there's something in you that somehow is an imprint of a moral order in the world. But then, look, there's that larger question of where did that come from? And partly it's faith and partly it's reasoning. I think the most reasonable answer is Catholicism.
Can I give an input as to like where Buddhism thinks it come from?
Sure.
So Buddhism thinks that it comes from this prince who spent a lot of time and like lifetime traveling the world and then living with people and figuring out karma and the principle of life. So it's basically just from, like, it's the same kind of principle, which is like figured out from living among people. It was not figured out from listening to a higher voice. Mm-hmm. So that
I would have this dialogue with you
anything?
for a long time, but then I would say, what is it about people when we're in their society, our moral sense becomes attuned, sharpened, and we have that sense of guilt for things we've done wrong. We feel impelled to help old people, to help the vulnerable, and so forth. Again, I would constantly say, why?
It would be like a chicken or egg come first.
Maybe.
Right.
But thank you. That was a great question. Thank you.
Where do you get this idea of the ideal if you're not going to use texts as literal, events, and you're not going to use history? What is this ideal of religion? Where is it from?
Well, Scripture this is for Roman Catholics. We have differences with our fallen away brethren. But for Roman Catholics, Scripture is one authority, but then you have tradition, right? There's Augustine, for example, the kind of patristic tradition of the Church Fathers, Origen, Athanasius, blah, blah, blah. And then you have the living magisterium of the popes. And then you have your own conscience. And all of these are in interplay together. You don't, at least for Christians, don't only look, or Catholics don't only look to the Bible as an inspired word, though it may be. You have to look to other authorities. Otherwise, it's not that you're free to reinterpret the Bible as you please, it's that you make yourself an authority, and that's an arrogant move. But in the light of other authorities, then you submit to a whole, not just fanatically reading one part of the Bible and concluding that you can create your own theology just based on, I read this, Jehovah's Witnesses or whatever.
There have been innumerable cases of popes just not being, what popes really should be, religious figures and the likes. But I know that you just said you should look towards them as, like the right way of studying or practicing your religion.
Yeah.
Are they always the absolute? Do you always follow them, or do you admit that there is some fault in how we choose popes? And
this is a wonderful question. So, in 1869 and 1870, the First Vatican Council happened, and among other things, it defined a doctrine of papal infallibility, right? That when the Pope addresses a question ex cathedra from the chair, and does so, in doing so, he addresses the entire Christian world, and he's talking about specific issues of faith and morals, then he's infallible. So in Britain at the time, the Prime Minister was a famous liberal, William Gladstone. And when these Vatican decrees, as they were called, came down, he was outraged, because he said that what the Pope had done was to take away the mental freedom of Catholics. And then he wrote a pamphlet. By then he was out of government for the time, so he had time on his hand. He wrote a pamphlet called The Vatican Decrees in Their Bearing on Civil Allegiance. And in it he said that the idea that Catholics are to look to the Pope on matters of faith and morals as an infallible authority means that anyone who becomes Catholic voluntarily relinquishes his or her conscience, becomes a mental slave of the Pope. Of course, Catholics at the time, British Catholics, were outraged that he would say this. They're also afraid because he was a powerful man. And they had only been legally emancipated in England just 40 years earlier. So what would become of this? Well, the answer, it fell to John Henry Newman, who at the time was a priest. He was a famous convert to Catholicism. Have you heard of him, John Henry Newman?
No.
Okay. It fell to John Henry Newman to answer this charge that Catholics were moral slaves of the Pope and that they couldn't exercise their own conscience. And he did it in a letter addressed to the Duke of Norfolk. It's too rich and complicated an argument for me to entirely restage. And it's worth looking up. It's the whole Gladstone-Newman controversy. But famously in it, he says that if I'm asked to do an after dinner toast, I would toast to my conscience first and to the Pope second, right? So conscience has priority. Now, does that mean that you have a complete right of private judgment when the Pope has given, let's say, a specific order, right? He's told you that you as a priest have to now preach no alcohol, even though Catholicism never has had this thing. No, you don't have. You shouldn't right away say, yes, Your Holiness, but you should have this disposition of trusting his authority. We're all subject to authority. You're subject to the authority of advertising. You're subject to the authority of commercials. You're subject to the authority of peer pressure. You're subject to and so the fact that you're subject to authority is an inescapable, inexorable fact of being human. But with respect to a true authority, right, someone who exercises legitimate authority over you, you should have a kind of docile disposition where you say, this doesn't go along with my conscience, or I disagree with what the Bible says or what the Pope just said, and right away rejecting it. That's not a proper attitude to take. And that's not doing conscience justice. That's just calling your own preferences conscience. But if you really sort of think things through, consult authorities, pray about it, and then you still come down and say, I think the Pope's wrong, I think we're allowed to drink, as in fact Catholics are, then you go with your conscience.
The Pope almost never speaks ex cathedra in practice, and like all of the misdeeds that you're describing weren't the Pope.
There
speaking.
were not exercises of infallibility.
Right. It's not like the idea isn't that everything the Pope does is infallible. It's only when he speaks ex cathedra. And again, how many times has that happened? Like
I think
like a few times. Yeah, it's like never happened.
But the Catholic Church still gives power to people who I think, in history at least, have proved less able to take it and probably shouldn't have. Like, there have been times where the Pope has been paid into office, basically. And so you would willingly subject yourself to adhering to what someone might say or the will of somebody who's been paid into and has not rightfully earned their place in there as the holiest person.
I would say the stories of awful popes are many, especially in certain periods in history it happens. But what you trust in this case, you do have to go to Scripture, right? And our Lord says to Blessed Peter, upon this rock you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. And so through the vagaries of human history and bad popes and good popes, you trust in the institution and you trust in the authority of the person who gave that promise to Peter and his successors. And so am I going to say, well, popes have made mistakes, therefore I won't subject myself to my own to the authority of the papacy with this rich magisterium? That's crazy. What authority is worth taking up? Right? My own. I think you're probably thinking my own. That's a very convenient one, because you can easily persuade yourself of anything, right? That's a very convenient authority. It's very easy the popes typically teach difficult things, right? Almsgiving to the poor, the dignity of life, right? Social justice with the Catholic social teaching. And those tend to be things that we don't want to follow.
Do you just do it for salvation? Does it not negate the point of doing good in the world?
You do both. Do both. Do both. It happens that if you are worried about the state of your soul, you'll also do good in the world.
I view that as a kind of a selfish thing instead of just doing it just to do good in the world.
Okay, well, if you do it for whatever reason, I would be happy for poor people in Easton, Pennsylvania, because you do it for its own purposes.
Okay.
Yeah.
My question, and I only have one.
Yeah.
So, do you think the whole secular politics really comes from Machiavelli's The Prince, and when we start seeing politics being more for self-gain instead of the adherence to the Catholic tradition, or do you have a certain place you like to put the blame on?
I like to blame Machiavelli. I also, at a more philosophical level, I think nominalism, right? The rise of nominalism, the idea that that you couldn't, through just natural reason, generalize about what anything. I mean, what God wants, what you want, what anyone, the category human is. You couldn't generalize about. Is the root of a kind of skepticism that says, at its most radical, it becomes the view that, well, one conscience might think it's okay to, allow old people to commit suicide by doctor through euthanasia, and one conscience might think it's wrong, and who knows which is right. You can't reason about these things because you can't generalize. But in the political realm, absolutely Machiavelli as well. Yeah, but it's also a tempting book, right? I think he was a brilliant guy. Yeah.
What is your account of the goal of this liberal system that you are so opposed to? What is your account of the motivations of the opposition here?
I'll give the most charitable. I think it's the sense that if we go back to trying to enshrine the highest good in politics, we'll go back to religious wars. So therefore, the thing we should do is to privatize religion. You do your own thing, you do your own thing. I think that's the motivation. I disagree with them, but I think if I were to give the most charitable account of the motivation, it would be that when we attempted to integrate the spiritual common goods with natural ones, normal ones, we had coercion. Now, my response to that would be: we have wars, we have coercion. They haven't gone away. So, but I would want to give the most charitable account of what that would be. I think when people talk to me and they disagree with me, it's often this fear of persecutions and coercions and wars. Now, I maintain that we still have those. They just take a different form.
Is your goal to encourage people to bring their personal religious values back into the public stage within the democratic liberal framework? Or is it some kind of deeper structural shift in how politics is conducted?
I would put it in the most general sense that in order for the church to survive, the church has to be involved in civilization as it was for most of Christian history, and that the rupture between the two has been bad for the church, but I would argue it's been very bad for civilization as well. So I would put it that way. In every country and in every area, that might take a different concrete form. One of the characteristics of Catholicism that's very interesting is its political flexibility. In one place, what people always complained about in the 19th century and kind of anti-Catholic, they would say that over here they're allied with small d Democrats trying to overthrow kings. Over there, they're allied with the most kind of reactionary forces. Over here, the church preaches socialism. Over there, it preaches private property. Or these churchmen do. And so on that count, increasingly I'm getting to a profound place of flexibility. What's firm is this idea that church and civilization have to be involved together and have to be in a fruitful interplay and dialogue together, more so than secularism allows.
So in your view, in the contemporary United States, is it sufficient just for Catholics to vote their religiously motivated conscience, then?
Oh, of course. But that's still not, for the most part, withheld. But I would say that, I'll give you an example of, again, I'll go back to it because I think it's very crucial, but I think the ready availability of really prurient content makes people less likely to think about holy things. And so Catholic political actors, they don't need to use religious arguments for this. They could just use public health arguments to try to limit the spread of prurient content, just based on public health and also the issue of the dignity of women and so forth. You don't even need to go to like chapter and verse in the Bible to do that. And so that might be an example of what a Catholic political actor could do within our framework. And by the way, it wouldn't be like, it would just be a return to like a 1960s, 70s censorship regime. We had it, were our grandfathers living under totalitarian regimes just because we censored porn?
I mean, I wouldn't say so, but I know some people that might bite that bullet.
I think libertarians would, yeah. But in that sense, it's not such a crazy radical thing, yeah.
I grew up with a bunch of Catholics,
Yeah.
and I know that more conservative Catholics are not the biggest fan of Pope Francis,
Yeah.
as opposed to, like Pope Benedict or
Yeah.
whatever. But, so that's like one question. But then kind of like a second prong of that question is, he is the first pope from Latin America.
Yeah.
And Latin America, I mean, at least compared to Europe and probably the United States, is one of the more heavily Catholic
Yeah.
regions in the world.
Yeah.
So would you say that is, despite him bringing the church in a more progressive direction, is that a good thing for Catholicism as a whole?
I am not one of those conservative Catholics who has a beef with Pope Francis.
Okay.
I love Pope Francis. I think that the Catholics you're talking about tend to be, they live in Anglo-American countries with a tradition in which they think that my judgment first. So the minute, it's precisely the discussion I was having with the young lady over there, that the tendency to immediately question authority. As soon as he opens his mouth to teach, you have to say, like, I don't agree with this. I don't. What do I think? That's some of what you're seeing play out. And I don't think, so again, I would challenge the premise as well. I don't think he's taking the church in a progressive or a conservative direction. I think he's just Catholic. And that means is, talking about social justice, that's not something that he came up with. Pope Benedict talked about social justice. Leo XIII wrote Rerum Novarum, the great encyclical on social justice. And so he's just bringing out things that have been in the armory of the church for a long time, and there's nothing new or progressive or conservative about him. He's just Catholic. I would say if you look at his actions, by the way, you'll see there was this great horror that he was gonna allow married priests and deacons in the Amazon because they have such a great shortage. And some of the people who have appointed themselves his progressive spokesman in Britain and the United States were sorely disappointed. He didn't allow married priests. When it comes to the question of ordaining women, he said that women have their own vocation. It's holiness and in the image of Mary, but not in sort of priestly apostolic role. And so, I would say priestly role, but not holy orders. Apostolic, but not in the sense of the episcopacy. So he's not proved to be the great liberal reformer that I think his liberal cheerleaders imagined he would be. And yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan. Yeah.
What were your thoughts on the Second Vatican Council? Were you one of those Catholic traditionalists who were opposed to it, or, I mean, considering your answer to the Pope Francis question, I assume maybe not too many strong opinions, but
it's a valid council of the Church, and it's I think I have my liturgical preferences. I actually like the Novus Ordo Mass that came out of the council. I like it especially in Latin because I think it's the language of the Church, and it should be preserved. and it is. I mean, I've gone to masses celebrated by Pope Francis, and he celebrates the Novus Ordo in Latin. And some of the documents are wonderful. So yeah, no, I'm not a cranky trad.
What do you say to the cranky trads who say that the liturgy has just been watered down and decentralized, and now it just really doesn't feel sacred, and it doesn't do justice to the content? Often, nuns playing acoustic guitars,
maybe it's because I'm lucky. I don't have to ever go to those kinds of masses. I go to St. Patrick's Cathedral. I go to other churches in New York where the new Mass is celebrated, but is celebrated very reverently. And I think when it's celebrated reverently, it has this wonderful quality. I mean, the fact that you hear from the faithful more doesn't bother me, and I sometimes find it very inspiring. That said, look, I mean, sometimes when I can, I often on Sundays I have to go to Mass with my son, and he's 2.5, and it's very difficult to manage. So I go to English Masses that end quickly. But if I'm going alone, then I do go to the traditional Latin Mass. And I gotta say, I mean, there's, that smoky awe and mystery, right? If you join a heavily ritualistic religion, you might as well get the ritual, at least from time to time.
Go full bore, yeah.
And I'm grateful to Pope Benedict, who in 2007 basically made it so that it was regularly accessible to any. If you can gather enough people in a parish or a diocese, I think, where you can say, we want this Mass, the bishop has somehow or other to accommodate you. So, but I'm a fan of both. Yeah.
Something that I wanted to ask about is that the way that I've interpreted much of what you have been talking about is that you want to see an increased role of religion within politics, and I guess I'm particularly interested in what role religion plays on government decision making, because two examples that I think of are of course, the current administration that we have. Evangelicals are a very solid part of this base, and two major decisions that were made, for instance, the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem came as a result of very intense lobbying by evangelical groups, and there also was the decision for the drone strike on Qasem Soleimani, which some believe is motivated by, and I don't entirely know the biblical context for this, but that Persia, which in its modern form is Iran, must be, I guess, punished or stopped to whatever extent. And I guess
the idea that the Trump administration struck Qasem Soleimani because of some biblical inspiration is like in the land of crazy conspiracy.
I mean, I'm not saying that was the sole motivation, but I guess what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, go on. Okay, sorry, I'll let you finish.
I guess what I'm trying to say is that I just am worried that if decision making is taken solely through a religious context, it might lead to decisions that politically are very irrational, if that is the only thing that is guiding decision making in that respect.
I think, first of all, there's an unproved assumption behind your claim is that religion is irrational, which I've been trying to kind of dialogue here with others, where at least the Christian tradition to which I belong literally holds the view that, literally is a stupid way to put it, but that God is reasonable. And what you think of God determines how you think you're called to respond to him. So if you think God is a God of reason, you do one thing. And if you think that he's so ineffably other and so different and he can just hand out crazy commandments, then you'll act differently as a religious actor. So I just want to push back on that premise without going deep into it, the idea that religious politics are necessarily irrational. But look, I could give you perfectly secular reasons for both of those decisions. So for the move to Jerusalem, Congress passed a law in 1995, I believe, requiring the U.S. State Department to move the embassy to Jerusalem and recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. But because it was thought of by the foreign policy establishment, and I don't just mean the liberal establishment, but also the sort of George W. Bush types, they thought of it would be so explosive if they did this that they can't do it. So the law allowed for a deferral process, and year after year they deferred. And I think that's one of those areas of Trumpian freshness where you can say, be like, like who cares? Like, you know, the fact is that everyone knows that Jerusalem will be the capital of Israel, so might as well recognize reality. And you have the backing of the not only the backing, you have the mandate of a law duly passed by Congress to move the embassy. You respond to it. You do what the people through their representatives have willed. So it's nothing. And then, by the way, all the predictions that it would set fire to the Middle East, none of that came out. No one. So, and then Qasem Soleimani, that was a riskier move, but Qasem Soleimani is a guy who had been at every step undermining American efforts to try to stabilize Iraq. Blood of hundreds, thousands of American troops on his hands with the IEDs that he would supply to various militias and terror groups. And so, as I suspect, the Trump administration wants to leave the Middle East, and I think we should. One way to do it is to leave the show with like a mic drop. And killing Soleimani was a mic drop, like boom. You know, we're gonna leave, right? We're gonna reduce our footprint, but watch out, there's still like drone in the sky. So I just don't see, I think it's odd to try to like give an esoteric evangelical reading on. I'm not an evangelical, as I've been making clear for 3 hours, but I still don't think like it was like an evangelical thing. So yeah, it was perfectly secular reasons for doing both those things. Yeah. All right, thank you. Thank you all for the really good questions. I really appreciate it. Yeah.